Chapter 4: Evolution and the Subjective Mind. Before proceeding to recite the facts demonstrative of the proposition that the brain is not the organ of the subjective mind, we must first show that the instinctive mind of the lower animals is identical with the subjective mind of man. The fact of continuity alone, if it can be shown with reasonable certainty, is presumptive evidence of the truth of the proposition, for it would require a violent stretch of the imagination to conceive the idea that an organized intelligence, once located in a physical structure and performing its functions independently of specialized physical organs, could suddenly change its method and organ of manifestation. At least, it would require the strongest kind of affirmative evidence to substantiate the proposition. Referring now to the table in Chapter 2, in which the faculties of the two minds are differentiated, it will be seen that that of intuitive perception heads the list of faculties of the subjective mind. I think no one will dispute the proposition that this faculty in man is identical with what is known in general terms as instinct in the lower animals. It performs the same functions in both, the difference being one of degree and not of kind, and they may, therefore, be defined in the same terms. I define the faculty as follows. Instinct, or intuition, is the faculty possessed by each sentient being, in proportion to its development and in harmony with its environment, to perceive or apprehend. Antecedent to and independently of reason, experience, or instruction, those laws of nature which pertain to the well-being of the individual and of the species to which it belongs. Instinct in the lower animals, as everyone is aware, is chiefly concerned in the preservation of the life of the individual and the promotion of the welfare of the species, and as I shall endeavor to show later on, the higher manifestation of the same faculty in man is promotive of the same general object, the difference consisting in its higher aims and ever-broadening altruism. For the present, it is sufficient to remark that the objective mind possesses no faculty akin to instinct or intuition. The faculty of inductive reasoning, as we have already seen, is the only distinctive faculty possessed by the objective mind, and that is the very opposite of intuition. The next faculty on the list is that of deduction, which is potentially perfect in the subjective mind. Inerrant deduction is the instinctive logic of the subjective mind, and this is as true of the lower animals as it is of man. It is the concomitant of intuition in the subjective mind and of induction in the objective mind. That is to say, both induction and intuition deal with general laws, the one by the slow and laborious process of gathering facts of experience, and the other by immediate perception, antecedent to experience and independent of reason. Deduction is the faculty which reasons from general laws or principles to all legitimate conclusions, and it is, therefore, the concomitant of both induction and intuition. Induction, depending as it does upon laborious cultivation for whatever degree of efficiency it may possess, is necessarily imperfect, and hence the imperfection of its concomitant faculty, deduction. On the other hand, instinct, or intuition, is potentially perfect, and it is, moreover, inherent in the subjective mind, and hence the potential perfection of the deductive powers of the subjective mind in every phase of its activity. From the lowest to the highest mental organism, especially when the activity of the brain is totally inhibited. The next on the list are the emotions. These obviously belong wholly to the subjective mind, since they are a direct inheritance from the lower animals, including, of course, all that existed before a brain was evolved. It is almost superfluous to add, in this connection, that the animal passions and propensities thus inherited, when regulated, elevated, and purified by reason and conscience, contain the promise and potency of all that is capable of imparting happiness and joy to the soul of man in this world or the world to come. There is no valid reason for supposing that the objective mind experiences any emotion whatever. Scientists tell us that every emotion, as well as every faculty, has its special cortical area or compartment. This may be, and doubtless is, true, but it does not follow that the emotions, as such, are felt by the objective mind. On the contrary, there is every reason to suppose that the brain merely registers the conscious emotional experiences of the subjective mind. That is to say, new brain cells are created for every conscious experience of the individual, emotional or otherwise, and these cells are the receptacles of brain memories. But they are only memories. The seat of the emotions is, nevertheless, in the subjective mind, where it was located eons before a brain was developed in the process of organic evolution. The next on the list is telepathy. There are many who hold that telepathy is largely employed by animals to supply their deficiencies in oral means of communication. I have not sufficiently investigated this question to warrant me in expressing a decided opinion whether animals communicate with each other by that means or not. But I have conducted a series of experiments which convince me that, under favorable conditions, man may influence certain domestic animals telepathically in a very marked degree. Be that as it may, certain it is that telepathy is a faculty of the subjective mind of man, and the power must therefore have existed, potentially, in that of his ancestry, near and remote. It is also certain that the objective mind of man possesses no power akin to telepathy. Of telekinetic energy little need be said in this immediate connection. It is the power of producing motion in ponderable bodies without physical contact or connection. It is that power which is sometimes manifested in so-called spirit phenomena, such as table lifting, rapping, slate writing, et hoc genus omni. It is that power which is sometimes manifested in the levitation of the body of the psychic. It is that power which enabled Jesus and Peter to walk upon the water. It is manifestly a power of the subjective mind, for no such energy has ever been manifested in the objective mind. There is no evidence clearly demonstrative that it is possessed by any of the animal kingdom lower than man, although certain animals possess a mysterious energy that material science has never been able to account for. For instance, what is that wonderful energy that enables certain birds to fly directly against a strong wind without the slightest visible motion of their wings? Again, what is that mysterious power that enables pertain microorganisms to propel themselves through a liquid in the absence of physical organs of locomotion? Speaking of this subject, Binet 1 has this to say: the polycystids have a very peculiar manner of moving. The motion is one of perfect translation, uniform and rectilinear. The animal seems to slide all of a piece over the object plate. It can go to the right, to the left, stay its motion and resume it again. It is free in directing its movements. Now, during this movement nothing can be seen to take place in the body from within or without. An analogous phenomenon is to be observed in the diatoms. Some scientists have wished to explain the mysterious motion by translation executed by the Gregorines as being due to an imperceptible undulation of the sarcode. But if there was any undulation whatever, one ought to observe a correlative movement in the granules inside. Now, this is something that is never seen. Thus there still exists a great deal of obscurity concerning the principles determining motion among the proto-organisms. The theories based upon muscular contraction that have been propounded from observing higher animals are by no means sufficient to explain the phenomena of motility among certain protozoa and protophytes. The italics are mine. Now, I do not undertake to say that the energy thus displayed is identical with telekinesis as manifested in the human organism. But since it is true, as the materialistic scientists tell us, that the potential of manhood resides in the amoebae, and since it is demonstrably true that man is endowed with telekinetic energy, there is no a priori ground for denying its existence in the amoebae. We are at least warranted in assuming, provisionally, that theory to be the true one until materialistic science can give us some sort of explanation of the phenomenon on other grounds. It is not, however, necessary to the validity of our argument to prove that unicellular organisms phenomenally manifest telekinetic energy, nor do I assume it to be true. It is sufficient to know that man is thus endowed, and that such powers reside in his subjective mental organism. That being true, it follows that the same energy existed potentially in his ancestry, near and remote. It will thus be seen that indubitable evidence exists in every faculty of the subjective mind, of its derivation from the lower animals, the difference being of degree. That is to say, the function of instinct is the same in man as in the lower animals, for all impulses, desires, or emotions which are promotive of the well-being of the individual or of the species, belong to the domain of instinct or intuition. And this is true whether they are manifested in the lower animals in the impulses of self-preservation and reproduction, or in the noblest acts or impulses of man, when they are promotive of the general welfare of humanity, physically, mentally, morally, or spiritually. The fact of the continuity of this intelligence being thus established, we have a right to assume that, since it began its career and continued to perform its functions for millions of years independently of a cerebral organism, it continues to perform its functions independently of the mental organism which has its seat in the brain. I repeat, therefore, with added emphasis that there is no a priori ground or reason for supposing that the brain is the organ of the subjective mind. Now, if we find that all a posteriori proofs tend in the same direction, we may safely assume the truth of the proposition to be scientifically established. I will now briefly state a few of the admitted facts bearing upon this question. Fortunately for my purpose, the materialistic scientists have themselves demonstrated the truth of the proposition by the use of the scalpel. Thus, ex-Surgeon General Hammond, in his presidential address before the New York Neurological Society, showed that certain faculties of the mind do not have their seat in the brain. In his great work on insanity, he reiterates his declaration and demonstrates by many original experiments that the brain is not the organ of the instinctive faculties. Among other experiments, he totally eliminated the brains of certain animals and found that the instinctive functions were performed precisely as before. He quotes many eminent authorities to sustain his position and explicitly declares that the instinctive faculties do not reside in the brain. He declares it as his opinion that they are seated exclusively in the medulla oblongata, or in the spinal cord, or in both those organs. Now, those faculties which are found not to be located in the brain are, as I have already pointed out, all faculties of the subjective mind. I am not disposed, however, to agree with Dr. Hammond in his confident statement that those faculties are located exclusively in any one organ of the body, much as I admire him for his genius and his vast learning. That declaration he doubtless made without duly considering all the facts collateral to the subject he was then investigating. Be that as it may, he has succeeded in demonstrating duality of mind by the use of the scalpel, and that is the favorite instrument of the material scientists when they set out in search for the human soul. And they have cut and carved, weighed and measured and chemically analyzed the brains of men, living and dead, and because they failed to find a soul in the brain, they dogmatically declare that man has no soul. Dr. Hammond, however, has demonstrated that they have all along been looking for it in the wrong place. But as he was not looking for a soul at the time, he did not recognize it when he discovered it. Materialistic scientists have succeeded in demonstrating that the objective mind is a function of the brain, and that it is inherent in the brain. They have demonstrated that each faculty or sense has a cortical area, or brain center, exclusively its own, and that when one of the brain centers is eliminated or paralyzed, the corresponding sense is destroyed. Thus, they argue, a part of the mind is forever obliterated, and it follows that when all the brain centers are destroyed, the whole mind is obliterated. Their conclusion is, of course, that there can be no such thing as a future life. Now, there can be no doubt of the correctness of their facts, nor of the soundness of their reasoning, so far as they pertain to the objective mind. And if that were the only mental organism existent in one v'd Washington Irving Bishop's taking off 96 the divine pedigree of man, vain would be his hope of a future life. The objective mind is the function of the brain. It is, therefore, inherent in the brain and necessarily perishes with that organ. But it does not necessarily follow that the subjective mind is inherent in any one or more organs of the body. On the contrary, all the facts tend to prove that it exists independently of any specialized organ whatever. We have already seen that the monera are without organs, and yet the subjective mind exists in them and performs its functions just as perfectly, in proportion to its stage of development, as it does in the most highly organized human being. Again, the facts of telekinesis demonstrate the proposition that the subjective mind can exercise complete control over unorganized matter. These facts are profoundly significant and point unmistakably to the conclusion that the soul is a self-existent entity and does not inhere in any organ of the body which it inhabits. In other words, the soul is immanent, that is, indwelling in the body, just as God is immanent in the physical universe, but not inherent in it. That is to say, as God does not depend upon the existence of the physical universe for the continuance of his own existence, neither is the existence of the soul dependent upon that of the body. Upon no other hypothesis can the immortality of the soul be scientifically or logically predicated, and I repeat, therefore, and stated as a scientific proposition that the soul is immanent and not inherent while in the body. It follows that the mind of the soul or subjective mind does not inhere in any special organ or organs of the body, although it employs those organs in phenomenally manifesting itself. It seems extremely probable that it pervades every bone, muscle, sinew, fiber, and tissue of the body. Certain it is that it is potentially able to control them all, and this is one of the evidences of its immanence in every part of the body. It is well known that it habitually controls the involuntary muscles and functions, and that the objective mind, through the brain and the nerve ganglia connected therewith, normally controls the voluntary muscles and functions of the physical organism. The subjective mind has, therefore, normally the greater part of the work to do, for its domain extends from the center to the circumference, from the action of the heart to the metabolism of every cell of which the whole body is composed. Now, a very important and significant fact in this connection is that the functions of the two minds are not mutually interchangeable. Thus, the objective mind cannot, of its own volition, move one purely involuntary muscle. Reciprocity, or joint control, is possible only in the mixed muscles, such as the sphincters and the organs of respiration. But of the purely involuntary muscles, the objective mind has no direct, volitional control. On the other hand, the subjective mind can, and often does, take entire control of the whole body and wields it at its will. This can be brought about experimentally by means of hypnotism. That is to say, when the brain functions are entirely inhibited, the subjective mind can be made to dominate the whole physical system. It almost invariably occurs when the body is in imminent and deadly peril. In such a crisis, the objective senses are benumbed, the brain ceases to act, and a condition of anesthesia supervenes. But, under the control of the subjective mind, the body acts with preternatural rapidity and precision, and feats of strength are performed that would be absolutely impossible under normal conditions. For a full discussion of this phenomenon, see the law of psychic phenomena. Spontaneous somnambulism furnishes many familiar illustrations of subjective control over both the voluntary and the involuntary muscular and nervous systems. I have cited these well-known facts for the purpose of showing how much more intimate and pervasive must be the connection between the subjective mind and the body than that which obtains between the objective mind and the body. The one controls the whole body without reference to specialized organs, and the other is limited in its sphere of activity and depends upon a highly specialized physical organ, the brain, for whatever efficiency it may possess in its limited domain. The subjective mind, as shown in its phylogenetic history, acts with equal efficiency in a highly specialized organism, with the functions of the brain in total abeyance, as in hypnotism, or in a crude physical organism destitute of a brain, as in the animals of the Archaeolithic epoch, or in animals destitute of any physical organs whatever, as in the Mon era. The difference being thus provisionally established, we might reasonably expect to find that the time limit of reaction to peripheral stimuli would be materially decreased during hypnosis. I say we might reasonably expect this result, for the reason that when normal conditions prevail, that is, when the objective mind is in control, and a stimulus is applied to an extremity, say the foot, it requires a measurable length of time for the afferent nerves to convey the message to the brain, and then for the efferent nerves to convey a return message to the extremity, suggesting its removal from the source of irritation. It is reasonable to suppose, therefore, that if the subjective mind is in control, and if it pervades the whole body, the message would reach the seat of control in less time than it takes to send a message through one set of nerves from the foot to the brain, and to receive a reply from the brain to the foot through another set of nerves. Accordingly, we find, from the experiments of Professor G. Stanley Hall and others, that the time limit of reaction in a hypnotized subject is decreased nearly one-half as compared with that of the same subject in a normal condition. I am not unaware of the fact that Professor James, of Harvard, and some others have tried the same experiment with negative results. But a negative result possesses no evidential value whatever when it is confronted with positive results such as those of Professor Hall. 1,000 unsuccessful experiments prove nothing when they are offset by one successful experiment. I do not, however, regard this difference in the time of reaction as by any means conclusive, but it is a factor in the problem which is entitled to consideration, for it is one of the series of phenomena that we might expect to find. If the hypothesis is correct, that the soul is immanent in the whole body, and not localized or inherent in any part of it. Aside from the surgical experiments mentioned, however, some of the strongest proofs of the truth of this hypothesis are found in the phenomena immediately preceding the death of the body and in the phenomena of hypnotism. When death approaches, we find the observable phenomena to be precisely what we should have a right to expect if it is true that the soul of man is immortal, and that it is therefore immanent and not inherent in the body. We also find that the objective mind, on the approach of death, exhibits precisely the phenomena which we should have a right to anticipate if it is true that it is inherent in the brain, and consequently perishes with that organ. The respective phenomena of the two minds, then exhibited, are simply these. The objective mind, in exact proportion to the growing weakness of the physical organism, ceases to perform its functions in perfection, and it is generally, if not always, completely obliterated before final dissolution takes place. Materialistic scientists have taken great pains to demonstrate this fact, because it is demonstrative that the mind, objective, is dependent upon a physical organism for its existence. And as that class of scientists know of no other mind than that of which the brain is the organ, they easily and logically decide that man is not destined to a future life. We may therefore accept their facts, but not their conclusions, although it must be said, in all candor, that if the brain is the organ of all that constitutes the intelligence of man, their conclusions are legitimate and cannot be successfully refuted. On the other hand, the phenomenal manifestations of the subjective mind become more and more pronounced as death approaches and the body grows feeble, and its strongest manifestations are made in the very hour of dissolution. This fact is attested by all the records of psychic manifestations, including those of the Society for Psychical Research. 1 Many instances are recorded of most wonderful psychic manifestations at the hour of death, by persons who had never before possessed any phenomenal psychic power whatever. The publications of the Society for Psychical Research abound in well-authenticated instances where telepathic messages were sent to distant friends at the hour of death, announcing the event and describing the tragic details. It is, in fact, the ultimate phenomenal manifestation of the universal law of psychic activity that the more perfectly quiescent the brain becomes, the stronger become the manifestations of the subjective mind. This, I repeat, is a universal law, beginning with the lightest stage or degree of hypnotic sleep and ending in ecstasy or in death. In the supreme hour, therefore, after the brain has forever ceased to perform its functions and the objective mind is totally extinct, there is an interval before the soul takes its final departure in which it shines forth with phenomenal luster, to give assurance to the world that the death of the body is but the birth of the soul into a higher and a more perfect life. This phenomenon is a part of almost every deathbed scene, although it is comparatively rare that it is so strikingly manifested as to attract attention. It is well known to almost everyone who is familiar with the phenomena of death that, just previous to final dissolution, the mind of the patient suddenly brightens, pain ceases, and other symptoms of convalescence often supervene to such an extent that the friends are filled with renewed hope. The experienced physician knows, however, how elusive are such hopes and how soon they are to be blasted. The psychologist knows that the supreme moment has arrived, that the brain has forever ceased its functions, and that the mind of the immortal part of man has phenomenally demonstrated its potential energy, its independence of bodily conditions. One of the most striking exhibitions of this phenomenon that have ever come under my notice was witnessed at the deathbed of ex-Governor Claude Matthews, of Indiana, in 1898. And I cannot more appropriately close this part of my argument than by relating the circumstance. On August 29, 1898, the morning papers contained the following Associated Press report, which is as concise and intelligent as it is possible to make it, and it is therefore reproduced entire. Wingate, Indiana, August 28. At 6:30 o'clock this morning at the quiet Mahari homestead, where he was taken immediately after his sudden affliction, ex-Gov. Claude Matthews passed away peacefully, surrounded by his wife and all the other members of his immediate family. There was prayer service, accompanied by the singing of hymns, at the bedside of the dying ex-governor. Mrs. Matthews was very much affected, and stated that she would give anything in the world if her husband would manifest by a single word his faith in Jesus. About 3 o'clock the minister in the course of the services asked the dying man if he believed in Jesus. The answer, as plainly as anyone could articulate it, was yes. The three physicians regarded this answer as remarkable, as all agreed that the particular part of the brain affected by the paralysis was that governing speech, and that the ex-governor would probably never have talked had he lived. It was the only word he spoke after he was stricken. He immediately lapsed into a profound coma, from which he did not recover before he passed away at 6:30 o'clock. Immediately upon the publication of this report, I addressed a letter of inquiry to one of the physicians in attendance upon the distinguished patient, Dr. Olin, but as he did not happen to be present at the time the event occurred, he turned the letter over to Dr. F. D. Allhands, who very kindly replied as follows: Office of F. D. Allhands, Physician and Surgeon, Wingate, Indiana, September 14, 1898. Dear Mr. Hudson, your letter was handed to me by Dr. Olin. He was not present at the time of the death of Mr. Matthews. Dr. R. French Stone of Indianapolis and I were present. Governor Matthews did speak the word yes very distinctly, so as all in the room could hear and understand him. The part of the brain that governs speech was undoubtedly affected. That was the opinion of all the physicians. I see no objection to your using my name. Yours truly, F. D. Allhands. The evidential value of this case can hardly be overestimated if the diagnosis of the physicians was correct, and it is difficult to imagine how they could be mistaken. The hypothesis we have been considering, however, affords an easy explanation of the phenomenon. The cortical area controlling the organs of speech was paralyzed, and in all human probability the whole brain had ceased its functions at the time when the event happened. The subjective mind was, therefore, active and in control. The brain action being inhibited, the subjective mind was amenable to control by suggestion, unhampered by any possible adverse autosuggestion. Everything, in fact, conspired to bring about the result. The supreme moment in the life of the dying man had arrived. The overwhelming desire of the stricken wife to know if he had faith in Jesus had been expressed. The religious training of his youth had taught him that a confession of trust in Christ was essential to salvation. The clergyman's question, uttered in a tone of solemn earnestness and addressed directly to the patient, constituted the strongest conceivable suggestion that an answer was not only possible, but was expected. In pursuance of that suggestion, the subjective mind of the dying man answered the question. In doing so, it simply exercised that control over the functions of the body which, as we have already seen, it normally exercises in all cases of emergency, especially when the action of the brain is, from any cause, inhibited. The most prolific source of evidence of the correctness of the hypothesis, however, is found in the evolution and the subjective mind. 105 phenomena of experimental hypnotism, especially that of amnesia subsequent to the induction of a state of profound hypnosis. Every student of the phenomena of cerebral activity is aware that all our normal mental experiences are registered in the brain. That is to say, every thought or experience of normal consciousness produces a corresponding modification of brain cells. New cells are created and old cells are modified, and these constitute the physical receptacles of memories of brain thought and experience. Every hypnotist knows that a profoundly hypnotized subject does not remember what takes place during the time of deep hypnosis,